Hello, America, and welcome to the fifth episode of the American Restraint podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Trepanier, and I'm really excited to continue on this journey with you. Okay, before we get going, just a little recap for those of you who are new to the show. This is a podcast about how to fix America. It is largely based on my recent book, American Restraint, Taming Hyper-Individualism and Hyper-Capitalism. I believe the country is fundamentally divided and that the forces of hyper-individualism and hyper-capitalism are largely to blame. I also believe in the power of federalism and shifting what DC can't do to individual states which can do. As usual, I ask for your review, subscription, comments, and sharing this podcast. It really helps get the word out about the show. Okay, so a quick recap. Last week we talked about how one of the two root causes for why America has come undone, hyper-individualism. I hope you enjoyed the discussion about, but what about my needs? And how an excessive focus on selfishness has left 40% of Americans lonely and unmoored. Today we dive into a deeper discussion about the second of these root causes of America's brokenness. What exactly is hyper-capitalism? This episode is titled, Let's Destroy the Middle Class. All right, let's go. First, a story about international trade. In general, I try to make this podcast less about the news and more about themes. But there's been a lot going on this month that I think highlights what hypercapitalism is and how some are trying to push back on it. So, unless you were living under a rock, you probably remember that earlier this month, President Trump announced a set of tariff hikes against almost every country we do trade with. The rollout of these tariffs has been criticized, and the stock market has been on a wild ride this month for sure. But it's important to understand the why behind these tariffs. What was Trump trying to accomplish? A couple of the key goals of the tariffs were to, first, address persistent trade imbalances that the U.S. has had with almost every one of our trading partners. Second, the goal was to encourage reindustrialization and bringing back manufacturing jobs to our country. The fundamental structural reason behind these goals was to show restraint against hyper-capitalism and try to restore the strength of the battered middle class. While most of the media and progressives complained about the tariffs, saying they were a tax on American consumers or the start of a trade war, they were being pretty disingenuous about the fact that the current international trading system is unsustainable. And why? Simply put, because the United States was subsidizing trading partners like Japan, South Korea, and Western Europe so they would stay loyal to the US, not the Soviet Union, during the Cold War. That deal between the US and our allies made sense for a few decades after World War II, until these economies of Japan, Germany, France, and other countries could rebuild their economies. But World War II ended like 80 years ago, and we still have these terrible trade deals with our allies. Add to all of these persistent trade imbalances over decades to the U.S. miscalculation to give China preferential trading terms as they entered the WTO in 2001. We thought if we encouraged China to become more capitalist, then they would become more democratic. Yeah, ask Hong Kong and the Uyghurs how democracy is going in China. So the net result of all these trade deals worked out great if you were an executive of an internationally focused American company, because you could either increase your profit margin by importing cheap plastic junk from China, or you could radically increase your profit by shipping American manufacturing jobs to China. But what about all of the Americans who lost their jobs or had their companies impacted because of unfair trading practices of Mexico, Japan, France, or China? This is the story of hyper-capitalism. International trade isn't inherently a bad thing. But once the libertarian economists get involved, the elites and oligarchs win, while the middle class loses. Bad international trade deals that favor multinational companies and not workers is an example of hyper-capitalism. But how has hyper-capitalism impacted the distribution of wealth in the United States? Everyone knows America has had periods where the rich have taken more than their fair share of the economic pie. For example, as the country expanded with new land and new opportunity, the fruits of the fast-growing economic pie were more widely available. However, since libertarian economic thought took over the Republican Party, we have entered the age of the ultra-rich, the billionaires, and the oligarchs. This new period of hyper-capitalism over the past few decades has been fantastic for the top 10%, who own nearly 70% of the assets, and especially the top 1% in America, who own 30% of the assets in our country. Yet for the middle class and the lower class, without significant assets, income stagnation is a major problem. Frequent job loss for the middle class is stressful. It's also stressful to have the costs of housing, healthcare, education, and other necessities rise much faster than middle-class wages or inflation. The current generation expects that they will not be better off than their parents. This is a major reversal of a trend that's been going on for like a century. Life expectancy also in America has actually gone down in the past few years. If your future economic and health prospects are going down, what does that say about your country's economic system? Clearly, something broke down as we shifted from capitalism to hyper-capitalism. So here are some more examples of how the shift to hyper-capitalism has led to the undoing of America. American big business practices are another example of hyper-capitalism. Walmart is the largest private employer in America with over 1.5 million employees and a market capitalization of about $750 billion. Walmart grew to become one of the most powerful companies in America by focusing obsessively on a few key goals. 1. Lower prices by forcing suppliers to employ cheaper labor in China rather than labor in America, like our story earlier about bad trade deals. And 2, lower prices even more by forcing much of the staff to work under 40 hours a week so as to reduce Walmart's cost of benefits. Apple, makers of the wildly popular iPhone, employs about 50,000 people in the US, and they are worth over $3 trillion. Apple became the most valuable company in America by focusing obsessively on a few key goals. First, build a popular product with high margins, and second, shift most manufacturing and billions in profits overseas to avoid paying U.S. workers and U.S. taxes. These are just a couple of many, many examples of how executives richly benefited from trade deals with China, while U.S. workers suffered. Apple CEO Tim Cook took home $136 million. This is just 2018. I don't want to distort things because last couple of years has been a lot of inflation. But that number, $136 million, is 2,400 times much more than the average Apple US employee makes, $58,000 roughly. The Walmart CEO, Doug McMillon, only made $24 million in 2018, which is 1,000 times more than the average Walmart worker makes, about $22,000. So Apple churns out millions of high-priced iPhones using Chinese sweatshop labor of about 350,000 Chinese workers. Apple and Walmart are just two highly successful examples of American companies who have grown rich by shipping millions of jobs to China and not sharing enough of company profits with U.S. employees. So one more note about Tim Cook. Forbes recently estimated his net worth of about $2.5 billion. Remember, he didn't invent anything. He didn't start his own company. He's a talented manager, but why does he get $2.5 billion as a reward for shipping hundreds of thousands of good-paying manufacturing jobs to China? Wall Street's financial chicanery is another example of hyper-capitalism. After Wall Street led America into the Great Depression, with its wild speculators, Congress and the President made significant changes to our financial system to ensure that the crash of 1929 was never repeated. For about 50 years, banks and financial institutions played a powerful role in helping finance American businesses as the post-World War II economy boomed. However, as the libertarians came to drive Republican economic policy, starting around the 70s, but really a big part of the Reagan administration in the 1980s, Wall Street was essentially allowed to do whatever it wanted. Gordon Gekko, from the iconic 80s movie Wall Street, proclaimed that greed is good, and financial executives agreed wholeheartedly. The 1980s introduced risky new practices to our financial system, like junk bonds and leveraged buyouts, LBOs, from corporate raiders. Here's one example. Former Treasury Secretary William Simon led the first LBO in 1983. He took a $330,000 investment and he turned it into a $70 million profit in only 18 months. With this new get-rich-quick scheme, Simon influenced a generation of Wall Street executives to come up with similar types of financial chicanery in order to become fabulously wealthy, without creating anything of intrinsic value. You see, hyper-capitalism works really well for the top 10%, and especially the top 1% of Americans. For the rest, not so well. During the past 50 years, Wall Street has come to resemble a casino more than a bank. Wall Street tries to convince average investors that the system isn't rigged and that Wall Street executives are both prudent and ethical. The 1987 crash, 1990 savings and loan crisis, the 2000 dot-com meltdown, and the 2008 subprime financial implosion of Wall Street were examples of Wall Street malfeasance. None of these crashes would have been so severe if we had adults leading Wall Street firms instead of frat boys who collect tens of millions of dollars in bonuses while continually putting the American economy at enormous risk. How did Wall Street help drive America into hypercapitalism? First, they policed themselves. Thanks to libertarian economic policies like the so-called free market, very little has been done to restrain the toxic influence Wall Street has exerted on American businesses and American workers. Second, they have made billions of dollars for themselves while providing dubious value to much of the American economy. Okay, so by now you know how we roll on this show. We try and highlight podcast themes with mostly 80s songs. I think a great one is from Pet Shop Boys. The song is called, fittingly, Opportunities. Let's make lots of money. From the chorus, I've got the brains, you've got the looks, let's make lots of money. It highlights the cynical view of using any means necessary to achieve financial success. The song's catchy beat and ironic tone critique the materialistic values of the 80s, exposing the greed and opportunism prevalent in the era's culture. Hypercapitalism, indeed. Okay, so back to the theme. Hypercapitalism has also led to massive business corruption. As the financial industry has expanded by using questionable business practices, big business in America has gotten the message that growth at any cost is a new acceptable societal norm. As capitalism has been replaced by hyper-capitalism, the frequency of fraud has increased dramatically. And as big business and wealth have become more concentrated in a smaller number of massively valued companies like the Magnificent Seven, the US government just hands out easily payable symbolic fines rather than even try to address systematic fraud and corruption. Trillion-dollar companies like Amazon, Apple, and Microsoft can easily write large checks to pay for fundamentally unethical business behavior. Every major industry now has concentrated capital and power in the hands of a few small firms. Finance, big tech, big pharma, big oil have paid hundreds of billions in fines over the past decades. We'll definitely talk more about this corruption and fraud in future episodes. So, hopefully you better understand the argument of hyper-capitalism. It starts with capitalism, which is a mostly good system that rewards hard work, allows for social mobility, creates a thriving middle class, and a stable society. However, when put into overdrive by libertarian economists, hyper-capitalism is a system that mostly rewards the rich, the elite, and the oligarchs. The middle class gets squeezed, and we have a much less stable society. Okay, so we've now discussed both hyper-individualism and hyper-capitalism, especially why they are the core reasons for the brokenness of America. Later this week, we'll tie both of these stories together as we go back to the 80s and reevaluate whether or not the Reagan Revolution was a success, a failure, or both. Okay, and one last song about hyper-capitalism. This one is a classic from the 70s, for sure. It's called Money by Pink Floyd from their classic 1973 album, The Dark Side of the Moon. So it's a kind of an exploration of capitalism and the corrupting power of wealth. The song has a great bass line, and the cash register sound effects really set the tone for its incisive lyrics. So, not to end on a completely glum note, but the people have the power of restraint. Restraint against hyper-individualism and hyper-capitalism. Hopefully you've enjoyed this episode. I'm excited to connect again later this week when we revisit the Reagan Revolution. Thanks for listening, and have a great day.